Behind me is Fort Jesus, anglicized nowadays as Fort Jesus, constructed on Mombasa Island in present-day Kenya by the Portuguese between 1593 and 1596 to protect Mombasa Harbor, again in present-day Kenya. Its thick walls, the first outside Europe designed to withstand cannon, are made of coral stone and lime mortar. The architect was an Italian familiar with new artillery fortresses being built in Europe. The fort changed hands numerous times during the course of its 400-year history, and ended up in British hands when they established Kenya as a protectorate in the latter part of the 19th century. In 1958, it became a national park, and it has remained so after Kenya gained its independence. In fact, I had a chance to go and visit Fort Jesus in 1985 when I spent a total of 3 months in that part of Africa. What I want to do now is share the screen with you. We're going to talk about the European age of discovery. Okay. Here are the terms. Rather a lot of them. By the end of this presentation, you should understand the motives for the voyages of European discovery, European maritime capabilities in terms of ship design, navigation, and so on, the voyage of Vasco da Gama to India and its significance, and Alfonso de Albuquerque and the creation of a Portuguese maritime empire. The voyages of discovery that carried European ships and European military force around the tip of Africa to India and to the Americas marked the third of three revolutions that brought Europe into recognizably modern times. The first two were the Renaissance and the Reformation. This explosion transformed the limited European ecosphere into one that embraced the world. It created far-flung European empires and eventually made European civilization the dominant world civilization. This entire epoch of European dominance is sometimes called the Vasco da Gama era, after the Portuguese captain who first reached India by the sea route around Africa. This era did not begin to diminish until 1945. Its end might be considered to be 1975, when Portugal dismantled the last of its overseas empire. But the effects of this long period of dominance are with us still. In a real sense, the conflicts between Iran and European powers over the passage of oil tankers through the Straits of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf crisis are just one more legacy of the Vasco da Gama era. The age of discovery was the product of a variety of political, economic, intellectual, and technological developments. We might divide the question of background into two parts: motives and capabilities. In terms of motives, this is actually a metaphor for luxury goods. When I say gold, I'm sorry, when I'm talking about gold as a motive. Actually a metaphor for luxury goods, especially spices. Europeans, especially the Portuguese and Spanish, wanted to bypass the Arab Venetian trade monopoly on goods from the East and get at them directly. Low bulk, high value items such as spices, cinnamon, turmeric, ginger, pepper, were highly prized in Europe. And there's a misconception that these were desired because they covered the taste of tainted meat. Actually, they were highly desired by the nobility and wealthy merchants for the same reason that we like spices today. They improved the taste of food. But because they were so expensive, they were also a tremendous status symbol back in those days. And they were considered to have medicinal and or aphrodisiac properties. Second reason, the European Weltanschauung, which is a fancy word for worldview, way of looking at the world. And this European worldview um, involved cultural inquisitiveness about nature and a religious imperative to fill the earth and subdue it, and a missionary spirit to convert other peoples to Christianity. A component of this European expansion was the enslavement of Africans, which became massive thanks to the creation and rapid expansion of plantation agriculture in parts of the Western Hemisphere, Brazil, the West Indies, and the Southern English colonies during the previous century. This in turn created such a high demand for labor that millions of Africans were forced into slavery. We estimate that between 1450 and 1900, some 11.3 million Africans came to the Western Hemisphere in chains. Of that number, more than half, 6 million, were enslaved during the 18th century alone, the 1700s alone. But what does that slave trade have to do with war? Almost everything. Slavery was a part of African civilization, as with every other civilization, and it was common for persons to be enslaved after being captured in one of the numerous conflicts between competing African states. Notice I said states, not tribes. African society was much more sophisticated politically than many people know, and Europeans acquired most of their slaves from these warring states, and to meet the insatiable demand for slaves, gave gunpowder technology to African states in a successful attempt to generate even more warfare, which in turn generated even more slaves. It doesn't stop there. European countries did not willingly share the lucrative slave trade with each other, but tried to monopolize it for themselves. Portugal was the first European country to engage in the West African slave trade and did what it could to stop other European countries from encroaching upon this trade. The other countries had to resort to war to force their entry into the slave trade. In terms of capabilities, we're talking here about navigational capabilities, such as the compass, the astrolabe, and the rudder. Prince Henry the Navigator, 1394 to 1460, mobilized knowledge, organized and equipped fleets for exploration, extended capabilities. And then in terms of ships, Mediterranean ships were too low and too heavy to make oceanic voyages. Prince Henry directed the creation of a new and much lighter ship, the caravel, which could sail further and faster, was highly maneuverable, durable enough to sail on the open ocean, and could sail much nearer the wind. This made the caravel largely independent of the prevailing winds. With the caravel, Portuguese mariners could freely explore rivers and shallow waters as well as the open ocean. The invention of the caravel was what made Portugal poised to take the lead in oceanic exploration. In terms of the navigational capabilities that Prince Henry the Navigator helped to enhance, you had first of all the compass, which already existed. That had been around since about 1300 or so. But Prince Henry the Navigator refined its use, and also helped to bring into being something called the astrolabe. And the astrolabe was a device that could use the sun's position at noon to help determine where a ship was in terms of latitude. That is to say, where it was in terms of how far north or south on the Earth's surface that it was. And then rudder, that's spelled Rutter. These were not exactly maps. They were instead books of notes that gave details of how to get from one place to another, and taking into account things like changes in currents, the presence or absence of seaweed. You might stop and anchor, or you might stop and scrape the bottom of the ocean. And if you'd arrive at the right place, you would feel gravel instead of sand. This kind of a thing. All these things were in these notebooks called rudders, and these were so highly prized that they were held as secrets. and then were highly sought after by other navigators wanting to get this vital information. Gunpowder enabled a small company of men to store up great quantities of energy and to release it on demand. This gave Europeans the edge over more numerous enemies. Vasco da Gama was the first, and aside from Columbus, the greatest of the explorers in terms of influence on world history. Until 1400, Europeans didn't know much more about the world than did the Romans. So the maritime expeditions that expanded their knowledge of the world were much in keeping with the spirit of the Renaissance, literally the rebirth. The Portuguese had a number of expeditions that explored down the coast of Africa. In 1487, an explorer, Bartolomeu Dias, located the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope. In 1497, Vasco da Gama set sail on a mission to round the Cape of Good Hope to reach India. This was actually controversial, with some Portuguese decision makers arguing that the route via the Mediterranean and Red Sea was better because it was shorter, and because the longer route would require a string of fortified trading posts to make it viable. But in any event, da Gama was sent to attempt this longer route. That was the decision that was made, and this was a military expedition consisting of 4 ships. The flagship and 1 companion ship carried 20 cannon each. 1 ship was smaller, but also armed, we know that, and presumably so was the supply ship, the 4th ship that also came along. 3 of these vessels were called carracks. It's a kind of a halfway point between a caravel and the Spanish galleons that you're probably familiar with from movies and so forth. When you see a sailing ship from this approximate area, usually they're showing you galleons. The smaller ship was a caravel, which I've shown you earlier. We guess that the entire expedition of all 4 ships had about 200 sailors. En route, da Gama used his firepower to bombard a port in Mozambique after an altercation with the locals. Near Mombasa, he turned to piracy, looting Arab merchants' ships that were generally unarmed in that area. In May 1498, da Gama landed at Calicut and traded for spices, although he failed to secure a trade treaty, which was one of his assigned tasks. But he determined for sure that a trade route existed that was worth developing. It was worth noting, by the way, that he lost half his crew to disease and had to scuttle 1 ship because he lacked enough sailors to man it. Da Gama's first voyage inaugurated what became known as the India Run, an annual voyage or set of voyages by armed Portuguese trading vessels. These depended upon the exploitation of the prevailing winds, which the Portuguese discovered over time by studying the differing amounts of time it took to transit via different routes. It proved faster, for example, to sail almost to South America before turning east to transit the Cape of Good Hope, rather than to sail directly down the coast of Africa. And it was faster to sail from Africa to India and vice versa at different times of year to take advantage of the shifting air currents between Africa and the subcontinent. Over time, Portugal acquired a number of colonies and enclaves to support the vessels engaged in the India Run, chief among them Angola, Mozambique, and Goa. Portugal held on to Angola until 1975. Angola is, if you look at Africa and you look at the red kind of squarish territory on the west coast of Africa, that's Angola. On the east side is Mozambique, and across over in South America, of course, is Brazil. Anyway, Portugal acquired all of these territories and did not let go of the last of them until Angola until 1975, and did not relinquish the last of its colonies, Macau, in present-day India until 1999. Over time, other European powers inserted themselves into the Indian Ocean basin, especially the Netherlands, who eventually secured present-day Indonesia, then called the Dutch East Indies, and ultimately England, who acquired South Africa, Kenya, India, and Burma. Although da Gama paved the way, it was Alfonso de Albuquerque who gained for Portugal a solid grip on the Indian Ocean trade area. Portugal had three goals: secure spices, expand Catholic Christianity, and to fight Islam. And all during this period, be it noted, there were major hostilities between Europeans, Christendom, and the Ottomans, who were Muslim. This would have included the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans in 1453, the first siege of Vienna in present-day Austria, that was in 1529, the naval battle of Lepanto in the Mediterranean Sea in 1571, and a second siege of Vienna in 1683. So these European voyages of discovery are moving, the ones that are going into the Indian Ocean basin or going into areas where Islamic influence is strong. And so to some extent, these European voyages of discovery were military expeditions, were also in effect kind of crusading expeditions as well. Well, basically, Albuquerque sought to gain control of all entryways into the Indian Ocean and to convert it into a Portuguese lake. Albuquerque captured Ormuz, which dominates the Strait of Hormuz, in 1507, captured Goa on the west coast of India in 1510, and unsuccessfully tried to capture Aden near the outlet of the Red Sea into the Indian Ocean in 1513. In 1511, he sailed from Goa to secure the eastern end of the Indian Ocean trading area, Malacca. In April 1511, Alfonso de Albuquerque set sail from Goa to Malacca on the north shore of the Strait of Malacca near the tip of the Malay Peninsula. With a force of some 1,200 men and 17 or 18 ships, this force conquered the city on August 24th, 1511. Albuquerque spared the Hindu, Chinese, and Burmese inhabitants, but had the Muslim inhabitants massacred or sold into slavery. This was not atypical. The Portuguese sought to create terror. In 1509, for example, the Portuguese fought a naval battle against Muslim opponents on the northwest coast of India, captured 8 large ships, sank 4 more, and captured the city of Diu. To make an impression, they killed all their prisoners, in some instances by tying them to the mouths of cannon that were then fired. During this period, the Portuguese established a cartaz system. It's spelled C-A-R-T-A-Z, a cartaz system, which required traffic in the Indian Ocean to carry a pass, indicating that they had paid customs duties at a Portuguese-controlled port, or else they were vulnerable to being taken as a prize. So if you were a ship transiting the area, the owner or the captain or whatever had to get a hold of a cartaz from the Portuguese showing that they paid, in fact, for the right to transit in that area, or they are apt to be captured by the Portuguese as a prize. And to do this, to make good on the cartaz system, the Portuguese relied upon their superior ships and especially their superior firepower at sea. In some cases, they could sink a ship with one salvo of cannon fire. This map shows the main European voyages of discovery between the 1430s, the first Portuguese ventures down the African coast, to 1522, which marks Magellan's circumnavigation of the world. It also shows the Spanish and Portuguese empires. In the late 16th and early to mid 17th centuries, these were supplemented by the Dutch, the English, and the French. The Europeans defended their access to the Indian Ocean trade via extensive fortifications, such as Fort Jesus or Fort Jesus in Mombasa, Kenya, built by the Portuguese between 1593 and 1596. It was Portugal's first major fortification to support access to Indian Ocean trade, but also a harbinger of things to come. Note the shape of the fort. It replicates the main features of the Tracitalian or artillery fortress. That was one of the dominant features of the military revolution. We'll talk about that in a future presentation.